I'm currently writing a book, or I've finished the draft anyway. It's going to the publishers on apocalyptic thinking in the United States. And it's largely about so-called secular apocalyptic thinking and how it influences our understandings of major environmental issues like population and climate change. I also work a lot on the militarization of environmental issues, particularly militarization of climate change. And that's very much part of this book too, looking at the role of the American empire and kind of permanent state of war right now in the United States, and how that influences people's environmental perceptions and kind of deepens the apocalyptic tendencies. One thing I've discovered is how much the dropping of the atomic bomb influenced particularly my generation growing up, and growing up in the midst of the Cold War, where we had duck and cover drills under our desks and where we thought the world might be coming to an end at any time. So kind of looking at psychologically how that influenced our generation to be more predisposed towards apocalypse, and then how that same frame carries over into things like the population bomb that became popular in the late 60s. And again, even the bomb imagery says something about that framing of thought, and that still very much remains with us. One thing I had also affected me a lot was how utopian movements, it turns out there were lots of utopian and millennial movements in the United States in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, and very similar to the ones in the 1960s and 70s, in which I participated. I was part of the Back to the Land movement, and how millennial ideas that we can create a new age right away, that the old world is coming to an end, and in the ashes we're building a brand new world and a new Jerusalem, how that also influences environmental thinking and also, and political projects, and especially the millennial part of it is not often helpful. I think the role of the military, it gets touched on, and certainly violence against activists who are trying to, for example, protect forests, that gets touched on or dealt with. People talk about that and organizing against it. But kind of the role of the military and militarization in framing environmental knowledges and understandings of resources and resource conflicts, I think we need to pay more attention to that in the field. And certainly also the role of militarization as a cause of climate change doesn't get talked about enough either. So I think we need to track kind of the financial interests behind this militarization as well, and how those flows of money work, and important to show those very vividly to people so that they understand what's going on. And I'm also very interested in defense think tanks and foreign policy think tanks, where their resources come from, corporate interests in that field as well. And so the nexus between corporate, government, security, very important to look at. And the environmental consequences of further militarization of borders, for example, very important to look at. But I was quite surprised at this conference, for example, this morning when Johan Rockström began with the Syria example, that the Syrian civil war was at least in part due to climate-related drought in the region, and Arab Spring also related to drought and rising food prices. It's kind of a naturalization of the geopolitical interests that have been involved in the region a long time. Of course, the U.S. war on terror is missing from that analysis. And so I think we need to pay a lot more attention to how these narratives are constructed, what knowledges are they built on, what data do they harness, because often the data is incorrect, and who is spreading them around, and why, and the role of the media too, and the interface between, I would say, defense think tanks or foreign policy think tanks, the military, environmentalists, and the media. I'm not saying that there's some sinister plot here, but there are definite confluences that are problematic. Well, of course, I do think climate change is a major challenge of the time, and is extremely urgent that we deal with climate change. But how do you do that? And I think the critique of political economy, or the political economy critique, is absolutely urgent, and to look at who is benefiting from climate change, who is harmed most. the role of big corporations and, of course, the fossil fuel industry in fueling climate change, and also preventing positive actions. I think one thing that's been pointed to at this conference a lot is the role of local action and movements, and broader also social movements in trying to bring about climate justice, inserting also justice into the center of climate debates. So I think those are things that are really important and they're hopeful time, but it's also a dispiriting time, especially with the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands these days. So I think we really need to talk about that concentration of wealth and what that is doing to the planet, and also how that influences, and neoliberalism, how that influences how we operate in academia and also in social movements. You know, there's a real pressure, there are resource pressures of the financial type on movements and academics trying to do critical research. Well, I certainly hope so, but I'm afraid I'm old enough to see these kinds of goals come and go, and a lot of lip service paid to them. But who's really at the table to ensure that these goals are implemented? I mean, how can we talk about these lovely goals when the distribution of wealth and power is so skewed? So I think they can be useful to the sense that they at least bring, you know, issues of gender equality, social justice into the piece, into, you know, the conversation. But what kind of conversation is actually happening and what kind of policies are actually happening? So I think we have to be careful not to be too excited about them. On the other hand, they are a lever, and an important lever to use. I think it's important, I mean, for academics to be at the policy table and researchers and to participate in those conversations, although sometimes it's a bit tricky because your ideas can be misused or your representation at the table is given as a sign that people are very open-minded, you know, and so it's not exactly a co-option process, but it's a process of a public relations process, let's put it that way. I think critical academics can be more powerful if they are also have kind of movement ties or involved in local actions, so that they come from a base of people really trying to put better ideas into practice. And then you sit at the table not just as somebody who's doing research in a library or writing, but you come as somebody who actually has experience on the ground and, you know, a more committed person. And I think also the people in a movement or in a group or in local action help keep you accountable to them in these processes with more powerful interests. I would like to share, I guess, two things. One is that we constantly need to be vigilant about population narratives, because we're also seeing, along with this kind of apocalyptic doom, militarization, a resurgence of neo-Malthusianism, both ideologically and on the policy level. So I think we need to be very attentive to that. That doesn't get talked about quite enough. And simultaneously, like I said before, the absolute importance of looking at militarization and military interests in the framing of climate change and climate insecurity. I think we have to be extremely mindful of that. And the kind of people who came to this conference are really well positioned to take on those militaristic narratives and to you know, show that they're problematic and not true in many cases, and then to come up with better framings. So I think we all have a responsibility to do that in this moment.